Dubai, DXB International Airport, late evening. According to the airline, a 27-year-old teacher from Ohio cleared passport control and sent a final message about her transfer to the hotel. Cameras capture a suitcase, a backpack with teaching materials, and a thin folder of printed itineraries. Within 24 hours, her phone switches cells and briefly latches onto an unnamed Wi-Fi network in an industrial zone on the outskirts. Then, silence. The baseline is simple: 4 weeks from arrival to the missing person report. In that span, there was no exit from the country, no transactions at her usual places, no calls to colleagues who expected to hear from her. There are only digital crumbs, camera hits, short pings, a charge for a Jeep safari, and a single route that was never part of any lesson plan. This story begins as a vacation with a safe solo tour and a teacher discount. It ends with the coordinates of a warehouse complex, a coordinated police operation, and the name of an organizer who for years disguised recruitment behind female social accounts with reviews and checklists. No sensationalism here, only facts, cautious versions, and one constant: a young teacher who wanted to show her students the world and found herself on its shadowed side. She was a 27-year-old elementary teacher from Central Ohio whose life ran on color-coded calendars and laminated routines. Her classroom walls carried phonics charts and a paper map of the world dotted with pins that her students moved during geography club. Colleagues described a quiet reliability: the first to arrive, the last to leave, the one who kept extra granola bars for kids who forgot breakfast. On weekends, she tutored for state reading assessments and saved the cash in a separate envelope labeled travel. Friends recall that when she talked about leaving the country, the tone wasn't dreamy. It was practical, like assembling a lesson plan for herself. The destination would change with airfare prices, but the intent stayed steady. Her online presence mirrored the classroom orderliness. Public posts were measured and apolitical: book stacks, running routes, snapshots of bulletin boards before the first bell. The private circles were smaller and more candid, where she saved lists for gear, vaccination reminders, and notes about travel insurance. She followed women's solo travel forums, language learning channels, and teachers who spent summers abroad. Her search history, based on later device forensics, suggested methodical research: visa eligibility, public transport cards, and safety briefings from consular sites. Nothing indicated spontaneity for its own sake. Each click supported a scaffold of preparation. Money habits told the same story. She flew budget carriers but paid for the higher-tier travel insurance. She bought used luggage and new locks. She chose hostels with female-only dorms, filtered by ratings and number of reviews. The card she used for travel was a separate account set to send alerts over a certain amount. Before big purchases, she moved small test charges to confirm the card behaved abroad. Her idea of risk management looked like a spreadsheet. Her family and colleagues fit into the plan as checkpoints. She sent her parents a rough itinerary with buffer language around connections that could shift. A close friend at school held copies of her passport and insurance details in a sealed envelope. She wrote 3 group messages: family, colleagues, and running partners, assigning each a different cadence for check-ins so lapses would be noticed from multiple angles. In her phone, calendar blocks read like a teacher's pacing guide: airport arrival, hotel check-in, local SIM purchase, first walking route. None of it felt theatrical. It was simply how she moved through uncertainty. The decision to go to Dubai formed during a winter stretch when airfare dipped and a travel forum praised the city's transit and lighting. She pinned screenshots of metro maps and museum discount days. She added a note that many solo travelers viewed it as logistically easy, while cautioning herself to verify which parts of the city encouraged walking. She read crowdsourced safety notes with the same concentration she used for reading rubrics. She kept the optimism, but she tied it down with specifics. Aspirations and constraints shared the page. Her first contact with the organizer arrived as a friendly reply under a forum thread tagged "Solo Female Budget Itineraries."
The account photo showed a woman by a pool, and the caption offered a teacher discount. The comment contained no hard sell, just practical-sounding tips about airport taxis and public beaches. The profile history looked seasoned: old posts, staggered timestamps, and replies to other users. A direct message followed with a PDF titled Educators Essentials Dubai that collected checklists already common in the community. On the surface, it was frictionlessly familiar. She approached the message like a worksheet to be graded. She checked the PDF's metadata and found a creation date consistent with the claimed posting history. She clicked through embedded hotel names and saw legitimate websites on the other side. She noted the "no phone calls please" line and flagged it, but rationalized that many forum deals used messaging only. She compared the prices to public listings and saw only modest savings that seemed plausible for a group rate. If there was a flaw, it camouflaged itself as convention. Her phone logs, reconstructed later, showed a progression from forum chat to an encrypted messenger with disappearing messages toggled on by default. The organizer offered a deposit option via a reputable intermediary, the kind widely used by travelers. She kept the payment small, enough to hold a spot on a city tour, and insisted on paying the remainder in person once she checked into the hotel she independently booked. She forwarded the hotel confirmation to herself and to her friend at school. Relief and caution existed side by side, stubbornly. The teaching year wrapped with ordinary tasks: a bulletin about library books, a parent email about summer reading, a staff potluck with leftover cupcakes. She left subplans in tidy stacks labeled by day, anticipating the week she would miss if flights shifted on her return. She copied worksheets for the colleague covering morning reading groups. She exported her phone's critical documents to a cloud folder and printed a single-page sheet of numbers, including emergency contacts and the nearest consulate. The act of leaving looked indistinguishable from the act of taking care. Running routes formed the last layer of routine before departure. She ran the same pre-dawn loop, logging splits into an app that highlighted consistency over speed. The app later provided a baseline for her daily rhythms, a quiet control group. A neighbor remembered the final run as unremarkable: a nod at the corner, the measured cadence of someone who liked structure. She packed a compact first aid kit with the same care she gave to crafting reading interventions. Preparedness, to her, was a kindness to the future self. In her final week stateside, she sent a string of concise updates to the 3 group threads: travel dates, flight numbers, hotel address, and the time she expected to buy a local SIM card. She set a reoccurring message scheduled through her phone to ping her parents if she missed a check-in by 12 hours. She also compiled a list of meeting points near her hotel: public, well-lit, camera-heavy, should a taxi or transfer fall through. The list reflected a habit of ending every plan with an exit. She did not romanticize unknowns. She disarmed them by naming them. The suitcase contents were pragmatic and traceable: clothing skewed toward breathable fabrics with a scarf she could layer. She labeled charger cables with small tags because classrooms had trained her to never assume equipment remained where she left it. The thin folder held printed copies of the hotel reservation, travel insurance, and a photocopy of her passport's data page. A notebook, the analog twin of her phone's notes, sat in the outside pocket. Each item played a role that could be explained without flourish. On paper, Chapter 1 of her trip reads like a checklist any safety-minded traveler could recognize. The facts show preparation, compartmentalization, and cross-verification. There is no evidence of reckless impulse or secrecy toward family or colleagues. The online contact that entered her planning did so through normal channels, wearing the uniform of trust built by long-lived profiles and recycled best practices. If a risk presented itself, it did so by imitating advice, and within that imitation, she followed the procedures that had always served her well. He did not sell danger. He sold familiarity.
The account that first contacted the teacher was one of dozens administered by a single operator who, according to later digital forensics, managed a portfolio of female personas designed to look lived in. Each profile carried a multi-year posting history seeded with harmless content: coffee cups, airport gates, sunset photos cropped from public sources. Timestamps were staggered to avoid obvious automation, and captions mimicked the speech patterns of travel forums. The effect was not charisma, but plausible routine. Target selection began upstream of any direct message. He filtered communities by keywords that aligned with solo travel, budget itineraries, and seasonal breaks used by educators. Within those spaces, he bookmarked users who posted practical questions about transit, SIM cards, and safe neighborhoods, because those signals correlated with a preference for structure and written checklists. He favored Americans for linguistic ease and predictable banking rails. He tracked replies for responsiveness windows to estimate time zones and work schedules. By the time he sent a comment, he had mapped when the recipient was most likely to read it. The comment itself was never aggressive. It offered an answer everyone could have given: where to find the MetroCard kiosk, which gate served the rideshare pickup, and then an unobtrusive reference to a discount for teachers. He never asked for private contact first. He waited for someone else in the thread to corroborate the tip with a generic "worked for me," an endorsement he planted weeks earlier from a different account. When a private message did follow, it felt like a continuation of a public service rather than the launch of a private transaction. Familiarity masked origination. Inside direct messages, his script used predictable anchors. He sent a PDF with essentials that mirrored community wisdom and listed hotels the traveler could verify independently. He encouraged paying small deposits through a mainstream intermediary that many users already trusted, avoiding unknown processors that might trigger suspicion. He declined voice calls with a stock explanation about time zones and background noise from site visits, an excuse calibrated to sound like a working professional in transit. He kept requests narrow and deferred larger payments until arrival, making the exchange resemble a hold rather than a purchase. Every step leaned on the user's own diligence to validate surface details. The personas were not only static archives, but active participants. He scheduled posts that matched seasonal travel patterns and reposted third-party safety reminders to establish credibility. He staged Q&A threads and answered both from the organizer and from supposed former clients, creating the illusion of community memory. He embedded EXIF-stripped images to prevent reverse lookups and used captions with location tags delayed by days to blur real-time footprints. He cultivated a tone of practical empathy, referencing teacher budgets and summer schedules without ever naming a specific school or district. Precision stayed on the recipient's side, vagueness stayed on his. Infrastructure supported the illusion. He rotated SIM cards registered under couriered identities and routed connections through residential proxies to emulate typical user behavior. He maintained a spreadsheet of forum rules to avoid moderator flags and kept a log of phrases that triggered automated filters. He tracked holidays in target regions to time outreach when users were more active. Devices were compartmentalized by persona to limit cross-contamination of cookies and tokens. If one account drew scrutiny, the others continued without visible disruption. Money flow followed the same incremental logic. Deposits were small and dispersed across multiple receiver accounts that forwarded funds through layered services before pooling upstream. He kept deposit amounts just under thresholds that prompt enhanced scrutiny in consumer banks. Refund policies existed in writing but were structured around deadlines and supplier terms, ensuring that most disputes expired before the victim could act. When a traveler asked to pay everything on arrival, he agreed, relying on the transfer handoff to sever the link between online conversation and physical custody. The financial trail was designed to look unremarkable at each hop. Recruitment was never pitched as exclusivity. It was framed as access to ordinary logistics made easier. He built checklists that echoed the recipient's own habits: photocopies of passports, insurance numbers, local emergency contacts. He reminded users to share itineraries with family, a piece of advice that created the impression of safety while adding nothing to actual protection at the point of contact. He used survey-style forms to tailor a tour, requesting arrival times and preferences that would later help synchronize pickups. Each requested detail looked reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a schedule that someone else controlled. Handoffs were engineered to look like hospitality. He sent a name and a plate number for a transfer driver, often with a real company name that operated in the city, but the vehicle that arrived at the curb bore no branding. He instructed the traveler to look for a placard with her name, a signal that flattened differences between legitimate and illegitimate pickups. If the traveler insisted on using an airport taxi, he offered to meet at the hotel lobby instead, preserving the separation between the online persona and any physical associate. At no point did he appear in person. Distance was a feature, not a flaw. Digital hygiene underpinned the entire operation. He preferred text over images and private messages to reduce forensic artifacts. He used disappearing messages for sensitive logistics and instructed associates to confirm pickups with a single emoji rather than a sentence. He backed up only the minimum needed to keep track of moving parts, and those backups lived on devices with auto-white policies tied to incorrect passcodes. His calendars were coded as errands rather than appointments. To an outside eye, the data looked like a sales pipeline, not a map of people in transit. From a behavioral perspective, his skill was not charm, but calibration. He learned the rhythm of the communities he infiltrated and spoke in their cadence. He absorbed their safety advice and mirrored it back as proof of alignment. He asked for less than a scammer and delivered more documentation than a hobbyist, the midpoint where suspicion tends to soften. When potential targets walked away, he did not press. The archive of personas assured a steady stream of new conversations. The scarcity he relied on was not time-limited pricing, but the limited attention of people who believed caution and verification would be enough. The teacher from Ohio fit his model because her diligence created a checklist he could pass. She valued written plans, so he provided abundant documents. She verified links, so he linked to real hotels. She preferred deposits over full prepayment, so he took deposits. At each choice point, he offered the safer-looking option inside a pathway he controlled. His method did not require anyone to ignore their own rules. It only required them to follow rules that could be imitated convincingly by someone who studied them first. Arrival data places her at DXB on a Friday night, local time, under standard winter traffic and clear weather. Airline logs confirm touchdown within 5 minutes of schedule and taxi to a contact gate on Concourse B. Cameras show her clearing immigration with a small queue delay and exiting with a wheeled suitcase and a compact backpack. The first text to family records a routine line about baggage claim and a plan to purchase water before the ride. She passes the currency booths without stopping and heads to the ride-hail pickup corridor. Nothing in posture or pace suggests confusion or distress. The arranged transfer appears in the footage as a driver holding a placard with her first and last name written in block letters. The vehicle is a late-model sedan without company branding, a common enough sight at a global hub to avoid notice. Plate checks later return to a rental agency, not a hotel fleet. Her phone connects to airport Wi-Fi briefly, then moves to LTE as she enters the car and leaves the terminal loop. A location snapshot sent to her own cloud account pins her within the first 2 kilometers of the highway heading south. From there, the map trail switches to cell tower handoffs rather than high-resolution points. The car takes a route consistent with normal traffic avoidance, exiting the main artery to skirt a construction zone. The first anomaly is not visual, but temporal. The detour adds 20 extra minutes without a corresponding traffic incident logged on public feeds. Her phone pings a tower cluster near a strip of mixed-use warehouses and small logistics yards. The timing overlaps with a short burst of activity on an unsecured Wi-Fi access point labeled with a generic device name. Forensics later show her handset looked for known networks and latched briefly, as many phones do, leaving a handshake record. After that, the device returns to cellular data and keeps moving. At 22:41 local time, a charge posts to our card for a one-night stay at a budget guest house. The authorization is valid, the merchant category code matches lodging, and the address is a legitimate property 12 kilometers from the airport. Hotel records later show no check-in under her name that night and no reservation connected to her passport number. The plausible explanation is a pre-authorized hold created through a third-party channel, a tactic that makes a ledger appear normal if anyone scans it quickly. She sends no message about a room or a key. The travel thread remains silent after the earlier update. The vehicle leaves the corridor of hotels and turns into a district where land is cheaper and street cameras thinner. Her phone's motion sensors register deceleration consistent with speed bumps and a final stop. A second Wi-Fi handshake occurs with a router using a factory default SSID and no password, the kind often shipped with small office setups. The device checks for updates and fails, then drops the connection on signal strength. The last precise coordinate usable for later mapping comes from a photo taken inadvertently by a lock screen camera gesture, a blurred image of a dashboard seam, and a gloved hand. The image lacks EXIF location, but the timestamp anchors the window. From 23:10 to just past midnight, the only telemetry is idle. No steps, no orientation changes indicative of walking, no camera activations. The battery drains at a rate consistent with background services running on low brightness. At 006, accelerometer data shows a brief tilt and vibration, a signature similar to a device being moved from an open air to a shielded space. Cellular signal drops 2 bars and stabilizes at a lower baseline. The phone does not power down, it simply loses radio quality enough to degrade precision. For most users, this would feel like a dead zone and little more. Morning brings a new cluster of signals that matter in hindsight. At 0812, a payment holds for a Jeep Safari operator commonly bundled with tourist packages. The operator verifies later that they never received the traveler at their hotel pickup point and marked the booking as a no-show. The charge remains in place because the terms classify the miss as late cancellation. A message in the forum where she met the organizer posts a generic first sunrise in the city photo under a different account tagged with an old date. The post is timed to coincide with when she would have been awake, preserving the illusion of normal orientation. Her own accounts show no activity. At midday, her device attempts to sync a cloud note labeled SIM numbers and fails, suggesting it was moved near but not within range of an open network. A tower handoff places the phone along the perimeter of an industrial estate with refrigerated units and small fabrication shops. Workers later interviewed describe seeing airport transfers pass through the area occasionally, usually as shortcuts or misroutes. No one recalls the specific sedan, which is not unusual given volume and repetition. The surveillance grid in this zone is a patchwork, not a net. Day 2 ends with an event that seems trivial until plotted against the rest. The flight app on her phone updates boarding passes automatically and prompts a return check-in, a feature she had enabled at home. The prompt goes unanswered. Later, this mistap will be one of the tiny tripwires colleagues cite when explaining why they began to worry. Small routines create their own barometers. In aggregate, deviations can be louder than alarms, but only if someone is listening for them in real time. Day 3 is a blank on her side and a continuation on the organizers. A persona aligned with the original profile posts a safety checklist for women that mirrors lines she saved in her notes before departure. The cadence is calculated to project continuity and to dull the edge of any stray concern. Her bank shows no cash withdrawals and no card-present purchases in supermarkets or transit kiosks, touchpoints most travelers hit within 48 hours. The absence is not proof of harm, but it narrows the set of benign explanations. Unplanned minimalism seldom coexists with unchanged itineraries. By the end of week 1, the administrative trail is split between two narratives. One is a travel ledger that looks superficially normal. an airport arrival, a lodging authorization, a tour deposit, and the lack of outlier transactions. The other is a behavioral ledger that is not: silent message threads, unclaimed hotel rooms, and a phone that moves like cargo rather than a person. Family and colleagues follow their agreed cadence and escalate when she misses the second scheduled check-in. The first calls go to the hotel and the tour operator. The next go to the airline and then to the local consulate. Each office confirms pieces. None can see the whole. What remains of the first 72 hours is a series of small confirmations and larger uncertainties. We have timestamps, plate numbers, and payment tokens that pass basic validation. We have a path that veers off the corridor of ordinary tourism into spaces where documentation thins by design. We do not have a camera frame that shows her entering a hotel room or a lobby check-in, nor a message that says plans changed. The gap is not an accident in the record. It is an outcome someone engineered by aligning their steps to the seams of a city. In that gap, the story of arrival becomes the story of disappearance. The account of captivity begins where the records thin and memory must carry more weight than cameras. The teacher describes a windowless room with a metal door and an air that smelled of cleaning fluid and cold dust. She notes the sound profile rather than the layout: an intermittent compressor cycling somewhere nearby, footsteps that echoed as if down a corridor lined with hard surfaces, and the faint Doppler of aircraft which suggests proximity to a flight path. Lighting was steady and cool, more like a storeroom than a living space. Timekeeping reduced to meals and the brief arrival of a bucket and a mop which set an internal clock even when the device was gone. She does not claim precise minutes, she anchors to patterns. Documents were taken early under the pretext of registration, the same word used when her phone was asked for SIM verification. Other women were present, some with English, some without, their ages ranging from early 20s to mid-30s by appearance. Accents indicated the United States, parts of Europe, and South Asia. The common denominator was the removal of identification and the standardization of names to first names only. Clothing remained, but belts and cords were replaced. There was no overt violence described in her statement, but compulsion was enforced through control of movement and the orchestration of uncertainty. Euphemisms filled the space where truth would have been clearer. She heard references to medical screening, contracts, and programs, terms that carry legal meanings elsewhere, but in this context arrived with no consent forms or independent counsel. She saw glossy brochures about maternity services with logos that later proved to be stock art. She noticed boxes of disposable supplies labeled with lot numbers and expiration dates, as one notices text when a classroom habit persists. In an adjacent room, she glimpsed cold storage units and clipboards with checklists, the kind that record flows without narrating their purpose. She is careful not to speculate beyond what she saw. Routines formed a pattern that later mattered to investigators. Breakfast came without variation around what she estimated to be mid-morning, based on her pre-trip sleep cycle. A two-person team rotated through the corridor with keys on a retractable chain. One wore gloves consistently, the other did not. A portable scale and a blood pressure cuff appeared twice, producing numbers read aloud and entered into forms without names, just codes. The corridor quieted during a window each afternoon when, by her impression, outside deliveries peaked, more engine noise, more door clatter, and then a lull. At night, the compressor drone deepened, as if additional units were engaged. Information moved in fragments among the women. An American told her she had been promised nanny work with housing. A European said she arrived on a visitor visa to help with a clinic, a phrase that in hindsight reads as a lure. Two women mentioned being told not to contact embassies because paperwork was already filed, a claim that trades on bureaucratic fog. The teacher's own instinct was to reduce the day to observable facts: the color of the door paint under the latch, the shape of the keys, the brand of the bottled water. Small details can later widen a map. The attempt to escape did not begin as a plan so much as a reaction to an opening. On a morning when the usual two-person sweep did not arrive on time, she heard a distant alarm tone and a short burst of radio chatter. A delivery truck idled longer than usual beyond the corridor, its reverse beepers cycling, then stopping. When the door to her room opened and the custodial cart was left briefly unattended, she noticed the lock tongue had not fully seated. A ventilation panel low on the wall had two screws that did not match the others by color. The string of small anomalies added up to a threshold she decided to cross. Movement was simple and contained. She pushed the door until the misseated latch yielded, slid into the corridor, and stayed low behind the cart. She followed the sound of air moving faster, a clue toward larger spaces. Two left turns brought her to a heavier door with white paint scuffed near the bottom, a sign of pallets or trolleys. She waited for an engine to cover the sound of the push bar, then moved into a loading bay. The bay opened onto a yard walled by corrugated metal. Along the fence line, sparse shrubs offered imperfect cover. She took the outer edge. The yard gave onto a service road where vehicles from neighboring lots passed at intervals. She tried to flag a taxi, but the traffic was commercial. Vans, pickups, a single water truck. A guard booth stood at the corner where the service road met a wider lane. She approached with hands visible, speaking the words that tend to trigger procedural responses: help, police, passport. The guard, an employee of a different company on the same estate, offered water and a chair, and then called a supervisor. That call, documented later in logs, brought the first official responders. The first contact with police was marked by caution and triage. Officers separated space and questions, ensuring she was safe and medically stable before asking for detail. She declined an ambulance initially, prioritizing the statement while her recall was fresh, and then accepted a medical exam later. An interpreter was offered, though her English remained coherent, and she was given time with a trauma-informed officer trained to structure interviews without leading. Her statement was recorded with anchors instead of assumptions: door colors, the feel of the floor underfoot, the number of steps between corner turns, the smell of coolant and citrus cleaner, the hum that rose and fell as though from refrigeration units in cycles. Details she provided became waypoints for a map. She described the white gate visible from the bay, the order of paint scuffs on the push bar, and a stencil on a pallet that read like an internal lot number. She drew the outline of the corridor with approximate distances, noting a fire extinguisher bracket without an extinguisher. She referenced a barking dog in an adjacent yard, heard at consistent times in the day, a weak but useful proxy for a routine in a neighboring business. She recalled the path of planes overhead, which helped analysts intersect known approach routes with industrial zones that matched her other cues. Devices, too, contributed once she had crossed the threshold into official custody. Her phone, still in airplane mode purgatory, was turned over to police and later produced handshake records with unsecured networks near where she fled. The lock screen photo with a blurred dashboard seam and a gloved hand gave a timestamp that synced with traffic camera frames on the broader access road. Card authorizations and merchant addresses stitched a timeline consistent with a detour into logistics terrain rather than hospitality corridors. None of these artifacts told the story alone. Together, they formed a trajectory. The officer's notes reflect a choice to preserve options rather than force conclusions. The teacher's descriptions were logged without labels, leaving room for the later alignment with permits, utility records, and warehouse lease data. She was assigned an advocate and offered protective accommodation, then given time to sleep before another round of questions. Evidence technicians began drafting requests tied to the industrial estate's limited camera grid and to the cellular towers that served the corridor. The guard booth call provided a time anchor cross-referenced against multiple systems. The case moved from absence to presence. The turn in the narrative is not a flourish, but a hinge. Words converted to coordinates. The teacher did not return to the building. She gave others a way to find it. The details she offered did not indict on their own. They allowed professionals to cross-check,
to walk the blocks, to listen, and to look for the scuffs, the brackets, the sound of compressors, and the patterns that corridors leave when people pass through them repeatedly. In that translation from experience to map, the center of gravity shifted. A room without windows became an address. A routine became a route. And a single exit, measured in turns and breaths, became the beginning of an operation. The operation began with a map that was more hypothesis than certainty. Investigators overlaid the teacher's corridor sketch with utility permits, refrigeration service requests, and delivery logs drawn from the industrial estate. A pattern emerged around a cluster of warehouses with recent electrical upgrades and short-term leases held through intermediaries. The team cross-referenced cellular handoffs from her phone with router fingerprints reported by nearby businesses. The intersection was not a dot, but a rectangle, 3 adjoining bays with shared access roads. That was precise enough to write a plan without pretending to know more than they did. Entry strategy favored simultaneity over spectacle. 4 elements moved before dawn. 2 to the suspected core bays, 1 to the neighboring lot likely used for overflow, and 1 to seal the service road egress. Local police led, with support from specialized units trained for low-light interiors and evidence preservation. The goal was not a dramatic breach, but controlled access that preserved chain of custody and safety for anyone inside. Ambulance crews staged out of sight, while a liaison officer coordinated with prosecutors for live warrant adjustments if doors led where paperwork had not yet anticipated. Radios stayed quiet except for essential calls. At the first target bay, the roll-up door resisted, but a side personnel door yielded to a key and lock technique taught for offices that were never meant to hold people. The entry team stepped into a corridor where the air temperature fell several degrees and the compressor rhythm matched the survivor's description. A loading area opened to the left, stacked with crates labeled as medical disposables and cold chain indicators. To the right, a series of rooms with metal doors carried no external numbers, only color scuffs where carts had nudged paint. A mop bucket sat where she had said it would be, a minor detail that still mattered. The second bay held what the files later called administrative infrastructure. A bank of desks carried laptops logged into social platforms under female profiles that matched the personas used in outreach. External drives contained batch folders of stock images edited to avoid reverse search detection, along with scripts and Q&A templates that tracked community language trends. A spreadsheet, sorted by arrival date, listed first names, nationalities, and coded notes under columns marked screening, transfer, and hold. None of these words, alone, incriminated anyone. Together, they described a pipeline. The third element found people. Behind 2 doors in the interior run were women from multiple countries, some seated on cots, one on a plastic chair, all with documents missing and belongings reduced to small piles. A portable scale and blood pressure cuff sat on a cart beside clipboards scored with check marks by code rather than name. On a shelf, investigators cataloged pamphlets about maternity services that later traced to image banks, not licensed clinics. In a locked cabinet, they found passports, including the teacher's, stacked in rubber-banded bundles. Officers separated occupants from rooms and routed them toward medical staff waiting outside the estate limits. Evidence technicians moved carefully to freeze a digital picture before devices could be wiped. They photographed the laptop screens in situ, captured volatile memory where possible, and clipped network cables into write-blocked taps. Whiteboards were filmed before marker stripes vanished under the friction of movement. A refrigerator room yielded numbered vials and consent forms without signatures, the paperwork of legitimacy missing its core requirement. In an adjacent office, a ledger recorded payments labeled as deposits, agency fees, and program contributions, terminologies that would later need translation in court. Outside, the service road unit stopped a sedan nosing toward the exit. The driver matched a face captured on cameras entering the estate on previous mornings and carried 2 phones, one with one-time passwords for social accounts and one for local calls.
In his trunk were placards with names and a stack of SIM card sleeves. His messages used the same minimalism described by the teacher: emojis, plate numbers, and terse time windows. He was separated, advised of rights, and logged as a critical link between screens and doors. The administrative bay's hard drives contained the connective tissue prosecutors look for when moving from suspicion to charge. Message archives captured the initial contact phrases, the shift to encrypted apps, and the anchor documents that borrowed community credibility. Folder metadata showed edits from multiple users, including a handle that matched rent payments on the adjoining residential building used by the suspected organizer. Calendar entries coded as errands aligned with flight arrival schedules scraped from public data. None of it shouted; it aligned too well to ignore. Medical teams documented the condition of the women without asking them to narrate more than they wished. Vitals were taken, injuries and marks recorded, and offers made for forensic exams according to each person's consent. Translators briefed them on their options: protective accommodation, legal counsel, and contact with consular services. Interviews, when given, were spaced to respect exhaustion and shock. The emphasis remained on agency, not extraction of detail for its own sake. Notes from these moments read like choreography adjusted to human pace. The arrest of the suspected organizer followed a route built from the logs the team had just seized. A rental payment led to a mid-rise apartment a short drive away, where building cameras documented a man carrying a laptop case with a pattern that matched footage from an earlier search. A warrants team positioned at the elevator and stairwell while another secured the lobby. Inside the apartment, devices were powered on and then isolated, preserving session states. The man cited consultancy work and subcontractors as he was detained, framing himself as distant from practicalities. His distance had been a design choice until the paper and pixels closed it. As the estate emptied of people and filled with evidence tags, the narrative shifted from a single survivor's memory to a documented scene. Inventory sheets tracked passports by country and number, medical consumables by lot and expiration, and ledgers by page and line. Cloud warrants extended the reach to servers hosting the outreach personas. The prosecutor's office began to convert nouns into statutes: trafficking, unlawful confinement, document withholding, fraud, and conspiracy. Parallel requests reached regulatory bodies wherever the paperwork referenced clinics or programs, because pieces of what happened in those rooms would need to be accounted for beyond criminal court. What happened that day did not end with a press conference or a single set of headlines. It ended with rooms sealed, victims moved to safer places, and devices queued for analysis that would take weeks. It ended with a teacher's passport logged into evidence and returned later to a person who now had to reconstruct more than an itinerary. It ended with a map annotated not just for where people were found, but for where systemic gaps had let a corridor exist at all. And it ended with the understanding that the next necessary steps were as procedural as the operation itself: care, counsel, and a slow conversion of evidence into accountability. The months after the operation were procedural rather than dramatic. Charges were drafted in layers, beginning with unlawful confinement and document seizure, then expanding to trafficking and conspiracy as digital evidence was parsed. Prosecutors moved cautiously, preferring filings that could survive appeal over headlines that could not. Defense counsel framed the organizer as a consultant who matched services and denied knowledge of coercion. That claim was tested against calendars, payments, and the proximity of devices to the bays. The narrative shifted from intent to control, which is where the law often finds its footing. Court schedules turned the case into a calendar problem. Hearings stacked in intervals, each one resolving a different motion about devices, chain of custody, or the admissibility of records captured from social accounts. Expert witnesses explained how disappearing messages leave enough residue to reconstruct sequences. Evidence technicians walked judges through router logs and handshake artifacts, the technical seams between buildings and people. No single exhibit carried the case. The weight came from alignment. Victim support ran parallel and independent. The women were offered protective accommodation, medical care, and legal counsel without conditioning help on testimony. Some chose to speak, others did not. Consular officers coordinated travel documents and return plans where requested. Trauma specialists structured care around sleep, safety, and control of information, the simple pillars that captivity had stripped away. The point was restoration, not recruitment into a narrative. The teacher's role narrowed to what she could verify. She identified her passport among those recovered and confirmed objects and sounds she had described before the raid. She declined to watch certain footage and was not asked to. Her statement remained a set of anchors rather than a script. When new details surfaced from forensic analysis, she was consulted only where her memory could fairly intersect with them. The process respected edges. Defense strategy emphasized distance and delegation. The organizers' attorneys argued that third parties rented space and ran operations, that laptops were shared, and that calendar entries coded as errands proved nothing. Prosecutors countered with file histories, author metadata, and payment trails showing rent and utilities aligned with key dates. A placard printer history matched names on recovered passports. Vehicle access logs knit drivers to bays at times messages instructed pickups. The picture sharpened without simplifying. A group of co-defendants emerged from the logistics layer. Drivers, a document runner, and a property manager faced lesser charges tied to facilitation and falsified paperwork. Some cooperated under agreements that required truthfulness tested against devices. Their statements filled gaps in timing and routines, confirming the meaning of coded notes and spreadsheets. Those confirmations did not replace the women's accounts, they sat beside them. The system moved as it often does, through corroboration that is unremarkable on its own. Outside the courtroom, policy questions followed. Inspectors reviewed leasing practices that allow rapid turnover of industrial bays with minimal verification. Platform teams fielded requests for faster takedowns of coordinated personas and for preservation orders that outlast user-initiated deletions. Banks examined deposit patterns that clustered just under enhanced due diligence thresholds. None of these inquiries carried the pace of a raid. They mapped the quiet parts of prevention. For the teacher, recovery became routine work. Sleep returned in fragments, then in longer stretches. She set predictable routes in her own city and rebuilt tolerance for ordinary noises. Doors closing, trucks reversing, air conditioners cycling. She met others who had been through captivity and contributed where she could. Checklists for digital safety, sample consent forms, and a list of questions to ask when offers arrived through forums. In small gatherings, she practiced saying only what she wanted to say. Control took the place of narration. When sentencing came, it reflected both the specific case and the broader harm. The organizer received a term that combined trafficking counts with conspiracy and document offenses. The court ordered restitution into a fund administered independently, separating assistance from the pace of appeals. Co-defendants received mixed outcomes based on cooperation and roles. The judgment's language focused on control and exploitation rather than spectacle. It did not pretend to repair what it could not. The case did not close in a single moment. Devices continued to yield contacts worth flagging to other jurisdictions. Warrants extended to affiliate profiles on platforms that had not existed when the first personas were created. A handful of women located through recovered lists received outreach through consular channels, an effort designed to inform rather than expose. The warehouse bays were re-leased after compliance checks and structural changes. The map that once marked a corridor now marked a set of checkpoints. The last pages of the file read like instructions more than epilogue. Verify organizers by independent calls, not messages. Avoid deposits to entities you cannot reach by phone. Share itineraries with active check-in protocols rather than static PDFs. Trust instincts about detours that add time without cause. If something goes wrong abroad, find uniforms, cameras, and people who log calls. Those systems generate anchors. The teacher's part in this is modest and deliberate. She keeps the list short, factual, and free of drama. It is the style of someone who knows that safety lives in the ordinary. We don't romanticize rescue. We document organizers, video calls instead of text-only chats, double-checking reservations directly with the hotel, refusing prepayments to unknown vendors, storing document copies outside the phone, a distress code with loved ones, and preset phrases to use under threat. If you or someone close to you is being pressured into medical services, surrogacy contracts, or work abroad where documents are taken, that is a red flag. If you are overseas and need help, keep copies of your documents in the cloud, note landmarks, names, and vehicle numbers, and contact official services at the first safe opportunity. This story isn't about the exoticism of a country. It's about those who hide violence behind interfaces and logos, and about those who, like a 27-year-old teacher from Ohio, find the courage to come back and speak so that others won't be lured by the same words.